Welcome to Horror Echo. Before we begin, don't forget to like, subscribe, and let me know where you're watching from and the time. Now, relax and join me on a journey into the unknown. A few months ago, I had an experience that left me rattled. I'd been driving for Lyft for a while, mostly during late night shifts. The roads were quieter, and the tips were better, but every once in a while, you get a ride that leaves a lasting impression, not in a good way. I've always considered myself cautious and careful, and while I've dealt with my fair share of strange passengers, nothing could have prepared me for what I was about to encounter that night. At the time, I didn't have a dash cam, though I sure wished I had one after this ride. The evening started off just like any other, with the usual sounds my old 2005 Volvo made as I cruised along the empty roads. But something felt off. Around 2 a.m., I got a ride request from a convenience store nearby. It seemed innocent enough, but the uneasy feeling in my gut told me something wasn't quite right. You know that feeling, right? When everything seems fine on the surface, but something just doesn't sit right? I pulled up to the store, and immediately I noticed it was closed. No lights, no cars in the lot, just empty space. As I got closer, I saw him. The man I was supposed to pick up. I slowed the car down, trying to get a better look. He was pacing outside, wearing a ragged hoodie that looked like it hadn't been washed in years. The sleeves were torn, and he moved erratically, glancing over his shoulder constantly, as if he were being watched. Something about the way he acted made me feel uneasy. My first instinct was to cancel the ride, but for some reason, I didn't. I unlocked the doors, and he slid into the back seat, not saying a word. As soon as I took my foot off the brake, I regretted my decision. Usually, passengers either stare out the window or scroll through their phones. But not this guy. He just sat there, staring at me through the rearview mirror. Not blinking. Not looking away. Just staring. I tried not to look back, but it was hard not to catch his eye. His gaze was intense, angry almost, which made the air in the car feel thick. Trying to break the tension, I turned on the radio. But as soon as the music started, he snapped at me to turn it off. His voice was deep, raspy, and gave away that he was a smoker. It startled me, and I gripped the steering wheel tighter, resisting the urge to look at him again in the mirror. I complied and switched the radio off. For a while, the only sound in the car was the hum of the engine. Eventually, he spoke. He asked me if I'd ever picked up someone I shouldn't have. This question hit me like a punch to the stomach. I nervously laughed and said, "Well, I hope not," trying to keep the situation light. But he didn't laugh. He just leaned back and muttered something I couldn't hear. Then, he started talking about how he used to drive for Uber. Apparently, he quit after some punk stole from his car. He was slurring his words, and I didn't catch everything, but I understood enough. I glanced at him in the mirror, and that's when I saw it. He was smiling the entire time. It wasn't a friendly smile, though. It was unsettling, like he wasn't all there mentally. Talking about being robbed and smiling like that, it didn't make sense. His final words struck me like a cold chill. It's funny how much trust you put in someone sitting right behind you. That was when I started thinking of him less as a crazy guy and more as a threat. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. We were getting close to his destination, but he didn't stop talking. The more he rambled, the more I felt my anxiety rise. Some of it was just nonsense, but parts of it were disturbing. At one point, he apologized to someone, though it wasn't clear if he was talking to me or someone else. He kept repeating that he was a bad person and that he hadn't meant to do whatever he had done. I was terrified, unsure of what he'd done or what he was capable of. A few minutes before his stop, he suddenly yelled that I'd missed the turn. But I hadn't. GPS clearly showed the right path. Despite knowing that, I slammed on the brakes out of sheer panic. He demanded I pull over, and I obeyed, my hands shaking as I did so. At that point, all I wanted was for the nightmare to end. I quickly shifted my car into park, hoping the situation would calm down, but as soon as I did, headlights appeared behind us. A police car. My heart raced as it crept closer, its spotlight scanning the area, briefly shining over my car. The man in the back seat immediately slouched down, trying to stay out of view. I could see him from the corner of my eye, lying flat on the seat, eyes closed as if pretending to sleep. I turned away quickly, trying not to let him catch me watching. The police car didn't stop, though. It slowly passed by, the spotlight sweeping across the road, and then it moved on. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, but the tension still hung in the air. The guy in the back didn't move for what felt like an eternity. I wanted to tell him to get out, to get away from me, but the words wouldn't come. I just sat there, staring ahead, counting the seconds. Finally, after what felt like a lifetime, he lifted his head. "You got lucky," he muttered, his voice low and almost smug. Before I could react, he opened the door, stepped out, and disappeared into the night without another word. I sat there for a moment, just staring at the empty seat beside me, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I was shaken, my hands still gripping the steering wheel, and all I could think was that I needed to get out of there. I ended the shift early, my nerves too frayed to continue driving. That night still haunted me, even after I got home. But things didn't end there. It wasn't until a few weeks later, while scrolling through my phone, that I stumbled across a news article that made my stomach drop. A convenience store had been robbed the same night I picked up that strange passenger. The robbery took place just 2 blocks from where I had met him. I felt sick to my stomach, realizing that I had been inches away from a dangerous criminal, someone who could have hurt me if he had chosen to. I didn't contact the police. For personal reasons, I tried to avoid law enforcement as much as possible, and I wasn't sure if my report would even make a difference. But the thought of that man still lingers, and I'm far more cautious about who I let into my car now. Every time I pick someone up, I can't help but wonder what their story is and if I'm making a mistake letting them in. I used to live in the city, and I always imagined that urban life was where I belonged. The buzz of the streets, the never-ending hum of activity, there was a kind of energy in the chaos that I thrived on. But that all changed after a traumatic experience. I developed a condition that made even the smallest noises unbearable. My psychiatrist called it phonophobia, and it was like a constant pressure on my chest, like something was bracing for impact, but nothing ever came. Every car horn, every slamming door, every shout from the street made my nerves feel like they were being shredded. I couldn't sleep, couldn't concentrate, couldn't even enjoy a quiet moment without feeling like I was about to snap. After a few months of trying to cope, I knew I couldn't stay in the city anymore. I had to get away. About 3 years ago, I found the perfect place. A cabin deep in the Pacific Northwest, far from the city and even farther from the noise that had come to haunt me. I don't want to be too specific about where it was, but it was in Oregon. The area was isolated, surrounded by thick woods, with no one around for miles. It seemed like the perfect escape. The cabin itself was small but cozy, just what I needed. It had been built to last with solid wooden beams and a stone fireplace that felt like it had been there for a century. When I first walked in, I was hit by the earthy scent of pine and old wood, a comforting smell, almost like an old cabin bed and breakfast you'd stay in after a day of skiing. The nearest neighbor was a 10-minute walk down a narrow dirt path, but I didn't meet her right away. The first few days, I just soaked in the peace and quiet. I woke up to birds singing, not the sound of sirens. At night, the only noise was the wind rustling through the trees. It was perfect. I did all my work remotely, so I didn't need to interact with anyone. I was finally able to breathe again. But about a week after I moved in, I heard a knock at the door. There was no doorbell, so I wasn't used to it. When I opened the door, I found a woman standing there, holding a basket of homemade preserves. She introduced herself as Helen and told me she lived about 10 minutes down the trail. She was in her late 60s, with long, graying hair that looked like it hadn't been cut in years, and piercing blue eyes that seemed to look right through me. Her presence was odd, not unfriendly, just blunt. She welcomed me to the woods and offered me the basket. She was almost forceful about it, practically shoving it in my hands, and I didn't feel like I had much choice but to accept it. I thanked her awkwardly, unsure of what else to say, but her stare lingered, expecting something more. I smiled, hoping that would be enough. She didn't smile back, though. She just kept looking at me as if waiting for me to say something, but I didn't know what to say. Finally, she spoke again, and I'll never forget her words. Always keep your lanterns full, your windows shut tight, and your wits sharper. There was something about the way she said it that made me feel uneasy. It wasn't a friendly warning, it felt more like a command, as if I was being told that I needed to be prepared for something. I didn't know what to make of it, but I nodded and thanked her again. After that, she turned and walked down the path without another word, leaving me standing at the door, holding the basket of preserves. For the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about her words. They replayed in my mind, but no matter how much I tried to understand, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. It was as if I had stepped into a world where the rules were different, where things weren't what they seemed. Maybe it was the isolation of the place, or maybe it was the strangeness of the whole encounter. But whatever it was, I couldn't ignore the feeling that Helen's warning wasn't just about keeping my home safe. It was about something much bigger. At that point, I was desperately wishing for the night to be over. As soon as I shifted the car into park, headlights appeared in my rearview mirror. It was a police car. I silently prayed, heart racing, watching as it passed slowly, its spotlight briefly illuminating my vehicle. The man in the back seat instantly slouched down, attempting to hide. I glanced over, and he lay flat on the seat, eyes closed, playing the part of an innocent, unaware passenger. I turned my gaze back to the road, trying to steady my breath. The police car didn't stop, just cruised by with its spotlight sweeping across the area. I let out the breath I didn't realize I was holding. My hands trembled as I gripped the steering wheel, waiting for the car to disappear into the distance. The passenger didn't move. He stayed lying flat, as though frozen in time. I wanted him to leave, to get out of my car, but I couldn't bring myself to speak. For what felt like an eternity, neither of us said a word. Finally, he lifted his head and, with an unsettling calmness, told me I had gotten lucky. Before I could react, he opened the door and walked away, disappearing into the night without another word. I sat there, stunned, unable to process what had just happened. After a moment, I locked the car doors and ended my shift early. My nerves were too frayed to keep driving, and my mind kept racing back to that unsettling encounter. It wasn't until a few weeks later that I learned something that made my stomach twist. While scrolling through my phone, I came across a news article about a robbery that had taken place that same night. The convenience store near where I had picked up that strange passenger had been robbed, just 2 blocks away from where I met him. I froze, the realization hitting me hard. I had been inches away from a dangerous criminal who could have harmed me if he'd chosen to. I never reported it. I didn't want to involve the police, not because I didn't think it would help, but because I had my own reasons for avoiding law enforcement. The whole situation was unsettling, and I couldn't shake the thought that I'd narrowly escaped something much worse. It made me more cautious, more aware of every passenger who climbed into my car after that night. I had always envisioned city life as the place I'd thrive. The energy, the noise, the hustle, there was something about the chaos that felt alive to me. But that all changed after a traumatic experience. I developed a rare condition called phonophobia, an extreme fear of sound. Every honking car horn, every slamming door, every shout from a passerby sent my body into a panic. It was like a constant, unbearable pressure on my chest, as if something was about to happen, but it never did. I tried to cope, but I couldn't stay in the city anymore. The constant noise was unbearable. So, 3 years ago, I made a drastic decision. I found a cabin deep in the Pacific Northwest, far away from the city and the noise that had become my nightmare. I don't want to give away its exact location, but it was somewhere in Oregon. It was isolated, no neighbors for miles, no traffic, barely any cell service. It seemed like the perfect place to escape. The cabin was small but cozy, and when I walked inside, the scent of pine and aged wood filled the air. It was comforting, like stepping into another time. The nearest neighbor was a 10-minute walk down a dirt path, but I didn't meet her immediately. The first few days, I soaked in the silence, the peace of being completely alone. I woke to birds singing, not the sound of sirens. At night, the only sound was the wind brushing through the trees. It was perfect, the escape I needed. Then, about a week after I moved in, there was a knock at the door. The cabin didn't have a doorbell, so it startled me. I opened the door to find a woman standing there, holding a basket of homemade preserves. She introduced herself as Helen, saying she lived 10 minutes down the path. She was in her late 60s, with long, gray hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to look right through me. There was something strange about her. She wasn't unfriendly, but her bluntness left me feeling uncomfortable. She handed me the basket, almost forcefully, as if it was expected of me to take it. I didn't know what to say, so I just smiled and thanked her. She kept staring at me, as though waiting for me to say more, but I didn't know how to respond. Finally, she spoke, and her words chilled me to the bone. Always keep your lanterns full, your windows shut tight, and your wits sharper. It didn't sound like friendly advice. It was more like a warning, something that made my stomach churn. I nodded, thanked her again, and watched as she walked away, disappearing down the path without another word. For the rest of the evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. I tried to brush it off. She was just a reclusive neighbor, maybe a bit eccentric, but nothing to worry about. I put the basket down in the living room, not even bothering to open it, and tried to get some rest. That night, a thunderstorm hit. It was rare for Oregon, but it wasn't unheard of. The power flickered on and off, and I lit a few candles, curling up on the couch with a book. The storm was loud, but I found it soothing, comforting in a way. It felt like the world had slowed down, and for the first time in months, I could breathe without the constant pressure on my chest. But then, hours into the storm, there was a knock at the door. Not a polite knock, but a loud, urgent banging. It startled me, my heart pounding in my chest. I hesitated for a moment, then grabbed a flashlight and went to check. I looked through the small glass window next to the door and saw Helen, soaked to the bone and holding her own flashlight. Before I could speak, she blurted out that she had seen someone near my woodpile. I was confused, but her words were urgent, and I knew something wasn't right. I stepped out onto the porch, shining my flashlight into the heavy rain, but I didn't see anything. Just trees and darkness. I asked if she was sure, and she nodded, her eyes darting nervously to the woods, as if expecting someone to emerge any second. I looked around, but I couldn't make anything out through the chaos of the storm. Before I could say anything more, she told me to be careful and turned to leave, walking back down the path toward her cabin without waiting for a response. I watched her disappear into the night, the glow of her flashlight fading in the distance. I went back inside, but the more I thought about it, the more questions I had. How could she have seen someone near my woodpile if her house was so far away? And why had she been snooping around my cabin in the middle of a thunderstorm? Was she lying to me? Something didn't add up. But confronting her in the storm wasn't something I was willing to do. I locked the doors, secured the windows, and sat in my room, listening to the rain. The storm eventually began to die down, but I still felt uneasy. Hours passed, and I thought about trying to sleep. It was after midnight when I woke up to the sound of a branch snapping outside my bedroom window. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze, straining to hear. I crept to the window, half hoping to see nothing at all. At first, there was nothing, but then I saw her, Helen. She was standing at the edge of the woods, her back turned toward my cabin, her long hair disheveled. I couldn't make out much else, just her silhouette. My heart pounded as I ducked out of sight, not wanting her to know I was watching. I stayed crouched there for what felt like hours, afraid to move. When I finally gathered the courage to peek again, she was gone. My mind raced. Why had she been out there? And why had she warned me about something that seemed so staged? My suspicion was growing. I didn't sleep at all that night, and when the morning light finally began to filter through the trees, I felt a strange mix of relief and dread. It didn't make sense, none of it did. And I wasn't sure how much longer I could stay here, in this cabin surrounded by shadows and unanswered questions. The pins and needles returned, crawling up my spine, as I quietly moved toward the door. I took a quick, cautious glance through the small glass window, and my stomach dropped. It wasn't Michelle standing there anymore. It was a burly, bald man with a thick beard. My heart raced, and I had to fight every instinct not to scream in panic. The situation instantly escalated from unsettling to life-threatening. I retreated as quietly as I could to the bathroom, locked the door behind me, and immediately called the police. As I spoke with the operator, the banging on the front door intensified, like someone was using a heavy object to break it down. The operator reassured me help was on the way, but all I could focus on was the growing fear in my chest. The sound of the front door breaking open was unmistakable. I could hear the crash as it gave way. At that moment, I truly believed I was going to die. The man, whoever he was, started destroying things inside my cabin. I could hear glass shattering and wood splintering, each sound worse than the last. I sat there frozen, praying he wouldn't find me. I didn't dare make a sound. The noise of destruction continued, but I didn't hear him coming near the bathroom. Eventually, the crashing stopped, and the silence returned. I remained locked in the bathroom, my mind racing, fighting back a panic attack. I didn't feel safe enough to move until I heard the unmistakable sound of sirens approaching. To my surprise, the police arrived quicker than expected, but not quickly enough to catch the intruder. By the time they arrived, he was gone. I begged them to search the property, to do something, but their response was far from helpful. They conducted a half-hearted search of the surrounding area and then shrugged it off. They didn't even want to search the woods, claiming it was too dense and that they were unlikely to find anyone there. I was beyond frustrated, my mind spinning. I pushed them to check Michelle's house, and after some resistance, they agreed. When we arrived, I was stunned. The cabin was completely abandoned. The officers confirmed that no one had lived there in decades. I tried to argue, to convince them that someone could have been squatting there, but they wouldn't listen. They said there was no reason to search further. I was livid. I begged them to at least check the property more thoroughly, but they told me living in such a remote area was a risk I was taking, and that it wasn't their responsibility. After that, they left, and I was left to process what had just happened. I didn't stay much longer in that cabin. I decided to leave, but not before spending one more night there. It was a horrible experience, but somehow, I managed to get through it without another incident. Things have been relatively normal since, but the experience still lingers in my mind. Some of my more superstitious friends think Michelle might have been a spirit trying to protect me, that she had some kind of supernatural purpose. Personally, I don't believe in the paranormal, and I'm much more inclined to think that Michelle and the man had been squatting in the abandoned cabin. But what I don't understand is why they targeted me, or why Michelle would warn me if she was planning on breaking into my cabin in the first place. I may never get the answers, but I can't shake the feeling that I was caught in something far more sinister than I realized. My name is Luke, and I met my girlfriend Catherine 3 years ago when we were both freshmen at Stanford. It's always been my dream school. Since I was a kid, I'd imagined going there. Neither of us is from California. Catherine's from Cincinnati, and I'm from a small town outside of Columbus, Ohio. That shared background drew us together, and I think it's why we've always clicked. Stanford is a big name, but it's not huge in terms of student body size, so being from the Midwest made us stand out a little. One of the traditions we've created is how we split Christmas between our families. Catherine is incredibly popular with my relatives, and they look forward to her being there just as much as they do me. Since her house is only a 2-hour drive from mine, we usually spend Christmas Eve with my family, who celebrates the night before, and then drive through the night to her house for Christmas Day. Before I met her, I didn't even realize that many families celebrated Christmas on the day itself instead of Christmas Eve. But one thing I've come to love about the holiday season is our late-night drive between our families. It's become its own tradition, and every year, we look forward to it. I think the first time we did it together is still one of my favorite memories. The route from my house to hers doesn't take us on major highways. Instead, we follow a series of back roads through fields, trees, and the occasional distant farmhouse. It's always late at night, which means we rarely see other cars. It's like the world is asleep, and we have it all to ourselves. We're a little quirky, but our shared love for Juice WRLD has made that part of the tradition, too. His music might seem a little cheesy to some, but when we drive, we blare his songs and sing the lyrics together. It's not just the music, it's the moment of shared connection. The road is our world for those few hours. The drive has always been special, but that one night stands out. It's not just the music or the road, but the way Catherine and I connect through the quiet, the isolation. It's like the world falls away, leaving only us, our voices, and the road ahead. It's something we both look forward to each year, even as time passes and our lives change. Those drives are more than just a way to get from one place to another. They've become part of the fabric of who we are together. This past Christmas Eve started like any other. After a warm, festive night with my entire extended family, we packed up my car around midnight and hit the road. The snow was falling lightly, and the roads were deserted, just as I expected. With the heat cranked up and our favorite music playing, everything felt perfect. But, as quickly as the calmness set in, it all changed in an instant. What I'm about to describe still stands as one of the most unsettling things I've ever experienced, probably the most unsettling. I was driving along, lost in the peaceful rhythm of the drive, when my phone rang, interrupting the music. I glanced down, a little irritated that I was getting a call this late, especially from an unknown number. I ignored it without thinking, probably another scam call, like the endless ones we all get these days. Catherine made a joke about how committed those call center guys must be, calling on Christmas Eve. I laughed and agreed, brushing it off. But then, just a few minutes later, my phone rang again. Another unknown number. I sighed, irritated, and let it go to voicemail. Catherine glanced at me, raising her eyebrow, but didn't say anything. I showed her the screen and said it was just another spam call. She gave me a confused look and said, "That's so weird." I didn't respond, just shrugged and refocused on the road. We let the music resume, trying to ignore the interruptions, but of course, not even 2 minutes later, my phone rang again. By this point, I was furious, cursing under my breath as I fumbled for my phone. I snatched it from the console and swiped aggressively across the screen, ready to tell whoever it was to stop spamming my phone. I noticed Catherine tensing beside me as I reacted so harshly. In hindsight, I probably overreacted, but I was fed up. I practically barked, "Hello," into the phone, ready for the usual sales pitch or script. But instead, I was met with silence. I turned up the volume on the car speakers, and a faint static buzzed in my ears, making me feel uneasy. Just as I was about to hang up, a voice spoke. A man's voice I didn't recognize. "Hello, Luke." I froze, my grip tightening on the wheel as my heart skipped a beat. I was so caught off guard, I nearly swerved off the road. I couldn't speak. My entire body felt like it was itching, the nervous tension settling in my chest. Before I could react, the man continued. He started rattling off personal details, my full name, my address, things about my life that no stranger should know, things no one but people close to me could know. My mind was spinning, trying to process what was happening. I wanted to pull over, but I couldn't. It was like I was caught in a trance, my mind racing, and my body frozen in place. I considered yelling at him, demanding he explain himself, but somehow, anger didn't feel like the right approach. I just wanted answers. After a few long moments of silence on the other end, I finally gathered enough courage to speak, trying to keep my voice steady. "What do you want?" I asked, the words barely escaping my mouth. The voice paused again before speaking the words that froze my blood. "I'm not here for you. I'm here for Catherine." At that moment, hearing Catherine's name felt like 1,000 needles pricking my skin. The horrified expression on her face mirrored my own. I blurted out that I didn't know anyone named Catherine, that he must have the wrong number. The man chuckled darkly and said, "She's sitting right next to you." That was too much. My heart raced, and fear gripped me. I quickly pulled over to the side of the road, shaking uncontrollably. I was about to say something when, in one swift motion, Catherine reached into my lap and hung up the phone. I literally screamed in her face, demanding to know why she hung up on a stranger who was making personal threats. She didn't respond, she just looked at me, her eyes wide with fear. I tried to call the number back, once, twice, 3 times, but it never went through. The line was dead. Catherine told me to keep driving, which, despite everything, I did. But I couldn't stop questioning her. "Why did you hang up?" I asked, my voice a mix of frustration and fear. She told me she was scared, and that I couldn't blame her for hanging up. I understood her fear, but something inside me didn't sit right. I kept asking myself why she'd hang up instead of helping me figure out what was going on. The rest of the drive was eerily silent. I didn't play the music again, and neither of us spoke. My mind was still spinning with a million unanswered questions. Who was that man? How did he know so much about me, about Catherine? As we drove on, I glanced at Catherine. Her face was pale, and I could see tears welling up in her eyes. She whispered, "I don't feel safe." I couldn't blame her. I didn't feel safe either. But something in my gut twisted, a small, gnawing feeling that I couldn't ignore. Catherine and I had been together long enough to know when something was off. There had been moments in our relationship, small lies, half-truths, things I'd caught her in. I knew I was probably being paranoid, but the doubts crept in. How could she have anything to do with this? Was I just being irrational? The rest of the drive passed in a quiet haze. I was consumed by the nagging thoughts swirling in my mind, but I tried to push them away. After what felt like hours, I finally glanced over at Catherine again. Her eyes were closed, and she seemed to have calmed down, but I couldn't shake the eerie feeling that something more was going on. And the worst part? That gut feeling that we weren't alone in this, like there was more to this strange cult than just some random prank. It was as if someone had been watching us the whole time, waiting for the right moment to make their move. We finally reached Catherine's house, but the rest of the night was clouded by the fear of what we couldn't understand. Neither of us spoke much once we arrived, and that unease lingered long after we had both gone to bed. I kept my phone near me, just in case that number decided to call again. But it never did. Family knew where we were driving that night, and they would never pull a stunt like this. I was 100% sure of it. Yet, despite my certainty, I couldn't think of another explanation. Even when we finally pulled into Catherine's driveway, the weight of what had happened lingered. I still didn't feel much better. It's been almost a month since that night, and I've yet to get any answers. Neither of our families were responsible, and we've asked all of them. Catherine swears she's just as clueless as I am, which leaves me with a sinking feeling that the person on the other end of that phone call had far more sinister intentions. You might think I'm overreacting to what could be a harmless prank, but I'm telling you, other than our family members, there is no one on earth who could have known Catherine and I would be driving that night. We didn't tell a single soul. There's no way someone could have had that kind of knowledge unless they were watching us. The realization is chilling. I've been on edge ever since. Every time my phone rings, I brace myself, half expecting that voice to come through again. I can't shake the feeling that it's only a matter of time before he calls me again. And the worst part is, I don't know who he is or what he wants. But I can't help but feel like I'm being watched, like something is lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to make its move. The days that followed that Christmas Eve were a blur. I tried to convince myself it was just a prank, that somehow, we'd just been the target of an elaborate hoax. But every time I thought about it, something gnawed at me, something I couldn't shake off. The voice on the other end of the line had known things about me that no stranger should. Details of my life, things that even close friends would struggle to recall. And when he mentioned Catherine, it sent a shiver through my spine. There was no way anyone could have known we were driving that night unless they had been watching us. But why? Why us? We spent the following days in a haze, trying to go about our routine as if nothing had happened. But the unease lingered. I couldn't stop thinking about that call, about the man's words. Every time I checked my phone, my heart would skip a beat, waiting for the next call. But it never came. Days turned into weeks, and still nothing. It was almost as if he had vanished into thin air. But I wasn't convinced. I couldn't let my guard down. I knew he was out there, somewhere. We asked our families, of course. Catherine had called her parents and asked them if they had anything to do with it. They were just as baffled as we were. My family, too, was adamant that they had no part in it. Everyone was confused, but no one had an answer. It seemed impossible, but I had to consider that this was something entirely outside of our families, something bigger, something darker. It was unsettling to think that someone had targeted us for reasons we didn't understand. But if that was the case, why wait until then to make contact? The more I thought about it, the more I realized how deeply unsettling it was. We hadn't told a soul we were driving that night. We hadn't even shared our route with anyone. And yet, somehow, this person had known exactly where we would be. It wasn't just an odd coincidence. It felt like a deliberate act, a warning or a threat. But why? Catherine had been just as shaken as I was. She swore she had no idea who the caller was or how they could have known about our plans. But she, too, felt that gnawing suspicion in her gut that something was wrong. It wasn't just a prank. There was something far more sinister at play here. One thing we both agreed on was that we couldn't keep living in fear of that phone call. We tried to go on with our lives, to pretend as if nothing had happened, but it was hard to shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every time I stepped outside, I'd glance over my shoulder, wondering if someone was lurking in the shadows. Every time my phone rang, I couldn't help but feel that dread creep up my spine, expecting that voice to come through the line again. We talked about it a lot, trying to make sense of it all. I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just some random person playing a game. No, this felt calculated, planned. Whoever this was had been following us, watching us, probably for a long time. But why? What did they want? And why had they waited until that night to make contact? I suggested calling the police again, but Catherine was hesitant. She didn't want to overreact, to seem paranoid. But I knew that if we didn't do something, we might never get answers. So, I took it upon myself to make the call. I tried to remain calm, to explain the situation, but the officer I spoke to seemed dismissive. "It could be a prank, sir," he said, not sounding particularly concerned. "There's nothing really to go on here." That response made my blood boil. How could they not take this seriously? I explained that we were being stalked, that someone knew personal details about our lives and had threatened us. But the officer didn't seem interested in investigating further. "Unless there's a direct threat or evidence of criminal activity, we can't do much," he said before hanging up. I felt completely helpless. It was as if our concerns didn't matter, as if we were just overreacting. Days turned into weeks, and still, no phone calls, no signs of the man. But the unease didn't fade. Every time I picked up my phone, I half expected to hear that voice again. Every time I heard a car behind me, I'd glance in the rearview mirror, wondering if someone was following us. It was as if the fear had become a part of me, something I couldn't escape. Catherine had started to withdraw a bit, too. She seemed more distant than usual, more on edge. I knew she was still shaken, but it felt like she was hiding something from me. She would jump at sudden noises, and her eyes would dart nervously around the room whenever we were out in public. I tried to talk to her about it, to reassure her that everything would be fine, but she was always evasive. One night, as we were lying in bed, I noticed something that sent a chill down my spine. Catherine had left her phone on the nightstand, and I saw that the screen was cracked. It looked like it had been dropped, but the crack was oddly specific. It wasn't just a random break, it was as if someone had deliberately damaged it. I reached for it, intending to ask her about it, but something held me back. What if she knew more than she was letting on, I tried to push the thought from my mind. I couldn't afford to let paranoia take over. But no matter how hard I tried, that voice on the phone wouldn't leave me. I kept asking myself the same questions. Who was he? How did he know so much about us? And most importantly, why did he say he was here for Catherine? It was one of those nights when the fear finally hit its peak. I woke up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, heart pounding. Something felt off, something I couldn't place. I lay there for a few moments, trying to calm myself, but the unease only grew stronger. I turned over to check on Catherine, but she wasn't in bed. The room was dark, and I couldn't hear any sound from the rest of the house. I got up, feeling the panic starting to rise in my chest. I checked the kitchen, the living room, but there was no sign of her. The silence was suffocating. I called her name, but there was no answer. My mind raced as I ran through the house, checking every room. The fear was overwhelming now. What if she had been taken? What if this wasn't a prank after all? Finally, I heard a noise, faint, but unmistakable. It came from the backyard. I grabbed a flashlight and rushed outside, praying that I was just overreacting. But when I reached the back door, I froze. There, standing by the fence, was a shadowy figure. I couldn't make out any details, but I knew immediately that it wasn't Catherine. I stood there, paralyzed, my mind racing. I considered calling the police, but something told me it would be too late by the time they arrived. I couldn't let this person slip away again. My heart pounded in my ears as I crept closer to the figure, trying to make sense of what was happening. Just then, a voice called out from behind me. Luke! I spun around, but it wasn't Catherine. It was the same voice. The man. My blood ran cold as I realized he had been here the whole time, watching me, waiting for the right moment to make his move. Are you ready for the truth? He asked, his voice eerily calm. I felt my knees buckle beneath me, my vision blurring. I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. Everything in me screamed to run, but my body wouldn't obey. This was it. This was no longer a game. This was real. The man's voice echoed in the quiet night, sending a shiver through me. I stood frozen, unable to move, unable to process what was happening. My body was paralyzed with fear, my mind racing 1,000,000 miles an hour. Who was this person? How had they found us? Why was he here? Are you ready for the truth? He repeated, stepping closer, his presence filling the space around me. The darkness of the backyard seemed to stretch, the shadows making him appear larger, more menacing. I tried to speak, but the words caught in my throat. The only thing I could do was back away slowly, still gripping the flashlight in my hand as if it would somehow offer protection. But I knew, deep down, that it wouldn't. Whatever this man wanted, whatever he had planned, it wasn't something I could fight off with a simple beam of light. The man stepped forward again, his eyes gleaming in the dim light, his face still obscured in shadow. I could see the outline of his figure now, a tall, imposing figure, broad-shouldered, and steady in his movements. He was completely calm, unfazed by the fear that was suffocating me. Why are you doing this? I managed to force out, my voice shaky, betraying the fear I was feeling. What do you want from us? He tilted his head, as though considering my question for a moment. Then, he took another step toward me, and I instinctively stepped back, my heart pounding harder with every inch he closed between us. I told you. I'm not here for you, he said, his voice low and almost amused. I'm here for Catherine. Hearing her name again was like a punch to the stomach. My blood ran cold. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. He knew her name, and he had said it in such a way, like he had been watching us for far longer than I could comprehend. "Where is she?" I demanded, my fear giving way to a surge of anger. I was done being afraid. "What have you done to her?" The man's lips curled into a small, almost imperceptible smile. "She's safe for now," he replied cryptically. "But you're not. Neither of you are." I tried to take another step back, but my legs felt weak, like they were made of rubber. My mind raced, but the words just wouldn't come. I had to do something. I had to protect Catherine, but I couldn't think straight. My panic was overwhelming, clouding my judgment. My phone, where was my phone? Before I could make another move, I heard a noise behind me, footsteps in the grass. I whipped around, my heart leaping into my throat. But it wasn't the man, it was Catherine. She stood in the doorway, looking disheveled and terrified, her wide eyes searching the yard, landing on me. "Luke," she called out, her voice trembling. I almost shouted at her to get back inside, to lock the door, but I couldn't. I couldn't move. The man's eyes flicked toward her, and a cold, calculating smile spread across his face. "She's the one I want, Luke," he said, his voice low and menacing. "I've been watching you both, waiting for the right moment." My heart sank. "Why?" I whispered, more to myself than to him. "Why her? Why us?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a step back and gestured toward the empty darkness beyond the fence, his face hidden in shadow. "The truth is much darker than you think. But you're not ready for it yet." Catherine took another cautious step forward, looking at the man with a mix of fear and confusion. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He looked at her then, his eyes gleaming in the darkness. "It doesn't matter who I am," he said with finality. "What matters is what comes next." That was it. The weight of his words hit me like a truck. My mind spun in circles. What did he mean by that? What was coming next? How did he know us? Why had he been watching us all this time? The man stepped even closer, his figure towering over me now. "You won't have long to wait," he said ominously. "Time's running out for both of you." My pulse quickened as I finally found my voice. "What are you talking about?" I demanded, trying to hold on to some semblance of control. "What do you want with us?" He smirked again, his gaze flickering between Catherine and me. "That's the question, isn't it? What do I want? I want you both to understand what's been happening all around you. To open your eyes." He took another slow step forward. "But it's too late for you now. You've already been marked. No matter where you go, I'll find you." The terror that had been clawing at my chest for so long intensified, threatening to choke me. I was so close to screaming. I was ready to run, to do anything to escape this nightmare. But I couldn't move. Catherine was still standing there, frozen in place. I had to protect her, but I had no idea how. "What do you mean marked?" Catherine spoke up, her voice shaky but defiant. "What are you going to do to us?" The man didn't answer right away. He stepped even closer, his face coming into the faint light from the back porch. His features were sharp, his expression unreadable. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said finally. "At least, not yet. But you're both part of something much bigger than you realize. You're connected to something that's been following you for a long time." I stared at him, my mind struggling to keep up with the words coming out of his mouth. Something following us? Connected to something? The man continued, his voice growing colder with each word. "You're both part of a pattern, Luke. A pattern that's been repeating for generations. Your family, her family, they're all connected to this, whether they know it or not. Catherine and I exchanged a glance, both of us at a loss for what he was saying. This made no sense. What was he talking about? What was this pattern? And how did he know so much about us? I don't understand, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. What pattern? What do you want from us? The man's smile faded, and his eyes narrowed. What I want is for you both to survive what's coming. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. But you won't if you stay in the dark any longer. You need to wake up before it's too late. I felt the ground beneath me shift, the sense of impending doom closing in around us. The fear I had been holding back was no longer something I could control. It was too overwhelming. The truth, whatever it was just out of reach, and yet it was suffocating me. I opened my mouth to speak, but the man stepped back into the shadows. I'll be watching, he said, his voice trailing off. I'll always be watching. And then, as suddenly as he had appeared, he was gone, vanished into the night. I stood there, my heart hammering in my chest, trying to process what had just happened. My mind felt like it was spinning, trying to grasp at fragments of his cryptic words. What did he mean by marked? What pattern was he talking about? And most importantly, why us? Catherine and I stood in the dark, our breaths shallow, both of us trying to make sense of the encounter. Neither of us spoke at first, too shaken to say anything. But eventually, I broke the silence. We need to figure this out. We need to find out what this guy meant, I said, my voice tight with fear. Catherine nodded, but I could see the fear still in her eyes. I could feel it too. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. And I had no idea how deep this rabbit hole went. Catherine and I spent the rest of the night in a daze. Neither of us could shake off the weight of what had happened, and the silence that hung between us felt like a heavy fog. The man's words replayed over and over in my head, like a broken record. You're marked, he'd said. You're part of a pattern. The sense of dread gnawed at me, each second more suffocating than the last. I wanted to scream, to break free from this nightmare, but I couldn't. We couldn't. The next morning, we didn't speak much. The air was thick with uncertainty. Catherine was still visibly shaken, her eyes red from lack of sleep. I could feel the unease in every inch of the house. The walls seemed to close in on us, and the quiet, once a comfort, now felt like a trap. We both knew that we couldn't ignore what had happened. But where could we even start? The police hadn't helped us before, and now, it felt like we were dealing with something far beyond their reach. I couldn't stop thinking about the man, the way he spoke so calmly, as though he knew something we didn't, as if everything had already been decided. The idea that he had been watching us for so long, waiting for the right moment, made my skin crawl. And the most terrifying part? I couldn't tell if it was a threat or a warning. Was he out to hurt us, or was he trying to prepare us for something we couldn't even comprehend? Catherine and I agreed we needed answers, but how could we find them? We didn't know who he was, where he came from, or what he wanted. And the more we thought about it, the more it seemed like the questions were endless. What pattern was he referring to? What was his connection to our families? We'd never heard of anything like this. It was as if we were the pawns in some twisted game, and the rules were beyond our understanding. The days passed, each one heavier than the last. We tried to continue with our lives, but the shadow of that man loomed over us, always present, always waiting. I found myself looking over my shoulder every time I left the house, checking the corners of the room, scanning the crowd for any sign of him. I couldn't help it. The fear was too deep-rooted, too real. Then, one night, it happened again. My phone rang. My heart leapt into my throat as I saw the unfamiliar number flashing on the screen. It was him. I stared at the phone, unable to move, unable to breathe. Catherine was asleep beside me, her breathing slow and steady, unaware of the storm that was about to hit us again. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to answer. "Luke," the man's voice came through, as calm and cold as ever. "I told you I'd be watching." I didn't respond. What could I say? The words had left me. I just sat there, frozen, listening to his voice. "You're still running, but you can't hide. It's already too late." My pulse pounded in my ears. This was it. Whatever he wanted, whatever he had planned, it was happening now. The line went silent for a moment, and I felt a deep, oppressive silence fill the room. And then, just as abruptly as it had started, the call ended. He was gone again. Just like that. No more words. Just an eerie calm that hung in the air, a sense of finality that I couldn't escape. I sat there for a long time, my phone still pressed to my ear, the emptiness of the call reverberating through me. I was alone with my thoughts, but it didn't feel like it. It felt like I was being watched, like there were eyes on me from every corner. There was no escaping it. Catherine stirred in her sleep, unaware of the conversation that had just taken place. I wanted to wake her up, to tell her, to share the weight of what had just happened, but I couldn't. What was there to say? The answers were still as elusive as they had been that first night, and I knew that no matter what I did, I couldn't protect her from whatever was coming next. I sat there in the silence, my thoughts spiraling, until the first light of dawn broke through the window. The new day felt like an illusion, a fleeting moment before everything changed. And I knew, deep down, that this was only the beginning. Whatever this was, whatever the man wanted, it was coming for us. There was no escaping it. The truth, the pattern, the reason behind all of this, it was still out of reach. But I felt it closing in, inch by inch, until there would be no more hiding. And as the first rays of sunlight crept across the room, I knew one thing for sure, it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Thank you for listening to today's story. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Horror Echo. Let us know if you've ever had a similar experience. We'd love to hear your story. Sweet dreams, if you can sleep.